All right. Hello, everyone. This is Warren. How's it going? You want to
Doing
start?
good here.
Good. We're going to start soon. Hopefully, this will help answer some of your questions, or if you guys have any doubts or anything. I'm going to do is focus mostly on kind of using the table more, not so much character creation or teaching D&D per se, but this is going to be more or less along the lines of fantasy grounds and things. And these are typical things that people struggle with, and also they might have misconceptions about. So also just let you guys know we are on stream on live, so if you don't want your voice captured, you can just send a message to me later if you have any questions. Going to post this on YouTube, and if anyone out there is live watching, just go ahead and put your questions in. I'll get back to them later. I'd like all of you to just watch the screen share, so I'm going to do a screen share right now. I don't advise you watch the Twitch or anything because it's behind, actually. So I'm going to do a screen share in Discord. All right, can you guys see the table?
I can see it.
Okay, so there's a live button. You just join if you're new here. You just click on that in Discord, and you'll be able to see the desktop. Okay, so we're going to get started. There are some topics I wanted to cover that tends to come up a lot when people first start using it, or even if you haven't played in a long time and you're just returning. There are generally a few stumbling blocks that occur when you're trying to join a new game or a new session. One of the reasons I'm doing this is because a lot of you are going to be playing in some games this weekend or maybe in the future. I want to try to help out some of the game masters, the event organizers, and some of the DMs out there that are having trouble with their tables. So that is part of the reason I'm doing this. The other half is just to provide some basic information about the platform. So the initial step after you install the application, you'll be prompted to to log in to a session if you're going to join one. Generally, before you start, you want to check with your game master and check for updates. So there's a button here that is current. So whether you have a license or not, even if you have the demo, you can check for updates and it will pull those in. But you don't want to do that unless you know what version or what your game master's at. Generally, they're at the same or higher, but that is something that does come up from time to time that can make the session kind of messed up because you might be on a different version. So that's something that comes up, especially when you're brand new and you're not certain of anything. That's definitely something you want to check out. Generally, when you are given a password and a server name, you're going to join via the cloud. There are still people who have you join by direct connect, but 90% I think the users are going to be using the cloud. So the cloud just allows you to facilitate the handshaking process. It stores your password. It does some things like that, but it doesn't actually host anything. The only thing it's hosting is the data for the connection and the IP addresses and such, but it's not actually hosting the game. The game is hosted on the game master or the host computer. So there is no cloud play or anything like that I know of. It's all hosted on the host's machine, actually. So when you are joining a session and you use the lobby or the connection here, it's just facilitating your ability to connect to the game. Generally, you'll get a password, you'll get the GM's name, and you might get a direct connect. It just depends on the situation. If you've already connected to a game, it will store up here in the history, so you don't have to go looking for it again in your next session. The idea here is that these things are in alphabetical order. You can search for a GM name, or you can join by a GM's name. And if your GM has just started their table and you don't see the session on here, just click on refresh. And generally, once his table is up and running, it'll show. Sometimes players will get eager before you even have the table running, and they go, "I don't see your game on here." Well, it's because your your game hasn't actually fully come up. So just refresh up here in the top right. It will refresh this cloud server. And down here on the bottom of this, you can see where it says public, 422 out of 569 games. So that means these games are listed. That doesn't necessarily mean you can connect to them. A lot of these are password protected. That's why it has this little padlock on it. But when you actually join the game, you'll click on whatever game it is that is current to whatever you're going to be playing. And then you'll click start. And generally, you'll get this attempting resolve connection to server. And then I suspect at any minute it's going to ask me for a password because I'm randomly joining someone's game without permission. Yeah, so authorization failed. The host is protected with the password. So you have to have the password to get into most games. If they don't offer a password, then it could be that their game is private and it's not actually showing in the cloud. But nonetheless, that's the steps you'll go through. And once you enter the correct password, Fantasy Grounds will actually pull in some data. It'll say acquiring file list, and it might take a couple minutes to actually load because it's pulling in all the changes, the content, the rule set, anything that goes with that game is being downloaded temporarily to your computer in like a cache folder. So that's how that works if you're going to connect to a table. There are a few occasions where you might have problems connecting to a table. I want to mention that because I've seen it in the forums. I've experienced it myself. Generally, if it's only one person, it typically is a case where your antivirus or firewall is blocking your connection from joining the table. So your computer is trying to protect you from viruses and DDoS attacks and those sort of things. So it's not allowing the data to go back and forth between Fantasy Grounds and your host computer. Other times it could be your internet service provider. They may have a certain protocol that you have to call them up and ask them to switch or change. It just depends on who your provider is, what kind of computer setup you have for software and that sort of thing. But generally it is a kind of a antivirus protection, security thing that usually blocks that. And sometimes you'll be able to connect to the table, but you won't be able to see a map or you can't download any of the content, the books or anything. So that's the first thing to try is you want to disconnect from the table, close Fantasy Grounds, restart it, try one more time. And if it gives you that same problem, then you want to look into allowing Fantasy Grounds to go through your firewall or creating an exception in your antivirus software. There are some that are very notorious for constantly giving people grief. One of them, I think, was Malwarebytes a long time ago with Classic. That was one of them that really caused that problem a lot. But I don't know if it's still the same issue. But nonetheless, those are some of the things you might go through when you're first starting to join a game. It can be a real hassle. It can be disheartening. It can make you discouraged. So make sure that you try that. The other thing is if you get on a table and you're having a lot of trouble, you might want to ask the DM if they have extensions because sometimes that can be an issue. So if they have extensions loaded and you haven't updated Fantasy Grounds, or maybe it's an extension that affects the way the Fantasy Grounds works, that could also cause problems. So there's kind of an issue with that. You don't really have any control of that either. But the game master should be kind of privy as to what's going on with their own table. But sometimes to troubleshoot those kinds of issues, they'll have to disable them one by one to figure out which one it is. But typically, you want to try to start without too many of those types of things, especially for a campaign. One shot, who knows? But for a long-term game, that could be an ongoing issue. So is there any questions about connecting and that sort of thing? So that was just kind of going over, some things that you might experience when you are, trying to connect to a game or you're trying to participate in a one-shot or something like that. You might have connectivity issues depending on your setup and what you're doing for the game.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
Although you said it facilitates being able to connect. If for some reason the Fantasy Ground cloud was completely down, could you still get a game up and running?
Yeah, you can do it through Direct Connect. The problem is that you have to do port forwarding, and not everyone has the IP4 internet. So if you don't have an IP4 connection and an IP6 connection, Direct Connect does not work. Gotcha. It's an older protocol, and sometimes you'll have people in other countries or even newer internet service provider will not give you an IP4 IP address, so it won't work with Direct Connect. Gotcha. But it does require port forwarding. So yes, the answer is yes, sort of, kind of.
Is there a common port forwarding range that you
1802?
Okay.
I think Unity uses UDP instead of TCP. It was a little bit different from Classic. There was a protocol. I don't remember what it was. UDP, I believe, is the protocol, and 1802 is the standard port. But as far as the other things, I don't remember. It's been such a long time since I used it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. You can probably find more information on that in the forums, but that is a something that you can do. I don't recommend connecting with a laptop or a wireless device. I don't know how many times I've seen people say, "Oh, Fantasy Grounds really sucks." Well, when you think about the parameters and what's going on there is a lot of data being transferred back and forth between Fantasy Grounds and the host. If for some reason the host is using wireless, it can even be worse because you lose packets and you just don't have the bandwidth. That's what it boils down to. Most problems in Fantasy Grounds connectivity is bandwidth. You can have the best computer in the world. It doesn't matter. You have to have the bandwidth. You have to be able to handle the data going back and forth. I've had people say, well, I got good internet. It's great. How come I can play World of Warcraft and not have any problems? Well, it's not exactly the same thing. And there are limitations regardless of what platform you use. So just remember that connecting with a wired device is more preferable than using a wireless device. It's just simple physical limitations. Some people don't have a choice. They don't have that luxury. I understand. But if you can help it, try not to use wireless. That's my suggestion anyways. It creates another point of failure is what it does. Generally, it works, but not always. And if you have 50,000 people using your internet while you're trying to do things, especially if you're streaming and playing, that could be an issue. So just be careful with that. All right, so the next thing I want to cover is a little bit of the initial setup that you'll come across when you first start a table up. So generally, you'll get this. You'll get the screen. You won't have the dice tower. Won't be there. There are some things that won't be active right away unless your GM enables them. I'm going to show you a kind of a tried and true way to set up Fantasy Grounds. This is not something you have to do. It's more of a suggestion. I teach this in all of my character creation classes and GM courses. But one thing is when you first come to Fantasy Grounds, there's an option that will come up. Generally, what it is the setup screen. So you'll get this setup, and what this is your first time you log in, this will come up. You'll have these direct links to the forums and user manuals. You hit next. This will ask you which modules or which data you need to load. So if you're a player, you want to ask your game master first which content you'll need, because sometimes he has the player's already built, so you won't need a lot of content. You might need like the player's handbook, or you might need a couple of the other books, but generally the GM will let you know which content to load. So if you click on modules, it will bring up a list of the content that the DM has, and anything that's shared, if you click on the load filter, it will show everything that's shared, which is these green check marks. Those would be content that the game master has shared with the players, which gives you access to that content. Generally, it's for character creation. you might have a book like the player's handbook or your core rule book to look at as far as, creating characters or looking up rules and such. When you do have access to the book, it'll show up in your library. So if once I've loaded the content, or that I've allowed it to be loaded if I'm the game master, all the player has to do is come in here and load the content. And that's up to the GM as to which content they'll need. So like here's the player's handbook. It's activated. It's loaded. Once that happens and you go to your library, under the library tab here on the right, you'll open up your modules. You'll have a list of the modules that you have loaded. And you can go to whatever book you want to look at. So in this case, we'll look at the player's handbook. And then you'll want to click the reference manual. Once you do that, you have access to the player's handbook. And it's searchable on the bottom left. You can click on any of the chapters. You can read stuff. You can do whatever you want. If you don't want to have to come back to the screen all the time, let's say you just want to open up the reference manual and then come back later. Instead of coming all the way through here, you can actually take that link where it says reference manual, left click and drag it, and put it in your hotkeys. So once you're done with that, you can bring the reference manual back up. This way you don't have to keep going through that avenue to get to it. So that's an important thing to remember with Fantasy Grounds. You have all these shortcuts down below, different combinations of keys like Shift, Alt, Tab. You can place a lot of things on here to make life easier for you. That's one of the biggest takeaways, I think, from this is to use that task or the shortcut bar on the bottom. Generally, when you have a link, most links can be dragged in there into this actual area. So you don't have to necessarily go through all that just to get to a book. But your library access is dependent on the host or the game master. So whatever they allow is what you can have access to. Even if you own a different book than your GM has, he has to allow you to have access to it. So if you wanted to create a character and you own Tasha's, but they don't, they're going to have to allow you to load that. And only you will be able to use that. So that's just a little caveat there for sharing libraries and such. So that is basically how you load a module or content if you need it. Generally, if you have pre-gens or characters already made, you don't need that much content. Especially if it's a one-shot, you're only going to play for 4 hours. Generally, you don't need too much. The next thing I'm going to go over is the layout of the table. This is kind of an important step. And then we're going to talk about character selection and that sort of thing. So I'm going to go over here to the right to characters. Generally, when you first start the table, it will give you a list of characters if they're already built, provided that you've already made them or that the DM has already pre-made them and you get to select from them. One thing you want to remember, though, is let's say you wanted to play this Dorig, this character here, this cleric. So when I click on this as a player, what happens is I actually claim that this particular character. So as a player, you take ownership of it. This is owned by Game Master because I'm actually the host. But once that player is selected, that actual character, it's no longer available in this pool. So if you're just looking at it and you want to look it over before someone else does, once you're done with it, you want to right-click on your portrait in Fantasy Grounds and release the character so that it goes back into the selection pool. There is no good way to preview a character without claiming it. So that's just a little heads up if you're going to be playing in a one-shot and you got like 6 different PCs to look at. When you're previewing them, you are essentially claiming that character sheet, and that pulls that away from the pool for other people to look at. So look at them one at a time. I've seen people claim like 5 or 6 of them. Other people get on the table and are like, hey, I don't have any characters to pick. And that's because one person was looking at all of them and decided that they didn't know that they had to release that character back into the pool. So that's one thing that's a little bit difficult about pre-gens, is that there's really no way to preview the characters unless the DM sends you the XML file or a PDF equivalent. So there's really no way to choose until you actually get on the table and pick it. And then when you're done with it, you'll be able to right-click on your portrait and release the character. So that's something that happens occasionally for one-shots and such. Generally, though, if you're making characters, it's not a problem. So any questions on claiming characters and, you know, releasing them and that sort of thing?
Does do the characters have to be tied to the campaign?
Yes.
Okay.
In the case of one shot, yes, but you can import characters, but the DM has to do that for you. So if you have an XML file, or if you already have something that you want to play and he approves it, you send him the XML file, he can import it into the campaign.
Gotcha.
Yep. But generally, when you're doing a one-shot, most GMs just use the ones I have, except for maybe Adventure League, where you have to go back and forth between different games. That's where that would come into play. So I have this.
This still works well for campaigns, though. I'm not planning on running a one-shot. I'm running a campaign.
Yes, it would be the same. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. All right, so I'm going to pretend like this is my character sheet here. This is the one that I picked. I already went through everything. The Game Master is going to put all the participating characters on the party sheet and the combat tracker. So the combat tracker is basically going to keep track of your spell durations. It's going to keep track of your hit points, your initiative, your turn order, those sort of things. So once your character is on the combat tracker, you'll be able to see it if your GM has put it on there. So here's my character, actually. So I won't be able to click on anyone else's characters, but I'll see them on the combat tracker. I'll only have access to this one unless I pick 2 or 3 characters, and you can do that. You can manage more than one character. It's just a lot of work because you have to tab between both characters when you're connected to the table in order to properly access and see what you're doing. And when you're on a battle map, it can be a little confusing because you might be first, maybe you have Vigan, and then maybe your next character is Doric. So you have to learn to switch between those. So I don't recommend having newer players manage more than one character for their first time. I'd give them a couple sessions before they actually have to start managing more than one character. This is also just a suggestion. You can do what you want, but I'm just kind of letting you know. So I have a layout here. Generally, when you first join a table, if the dice tower is enabled, it'll be over here on the far right. You notice I have this character sheet, and it's right here next to the combat tracker, the chat window, and the dice. And I also have it on the actions tab because that's where I'm going to spend most of my time. So we'll go through a little bit on the character sheets so you guys can get an understanding of where things are. And also, maybe if you're running a table, you can kind of help your players out a little bit more. So on the bottom right here, you'll have the dice tower. As a player or GM, you can unlock the position. So right now it's locked in place. So if you right-click, unlock it, you can actually move it. And I usually move it right here next to the dice underneath the chat window. You can put it where you want, but that's generally where I put it. As a player, you can also change the color of your dice. So if you come over here to the top right, you'll see this little color palette. You can actually open this up, open up the color picker, and choose which color you want. So you can move this around, or you can use the eyedropper and use, like, maybe you want to use a color off your portrait or something like that. You can use that to theme your dice to that color. So it depends on the color of dice. For right now, you only have white and black for letters, and you only have these primary colors. But in short order, I think this summer we're going to get the custom dice thing, I think. Don't quote me on that, but I know they're working on it. So there'll be custom dice with some animation, but I don't know when they're going to release it. But for the time being, if you're a player, you can customize the color and also the text from black or white. Nice thing about this is when you roll a die, the DM will be able to tell who rolled it, and when you are drawing shapes on a map for spells, those shapes will take on the color of the dice that you chose. So if you have multiple spellcasters, you'll be able to tell whose area of effect is whose. So that's the other benefit of changing the dice color. Generally, when you're connected to the table, there will also be a little dot next to each character that's connected, and it will show the color of the dice that they chose. It'll be just a little dot on the right-hand side of their portrait. But generally, that's something that you might do as a player, is you'll change the dice according to your taste. One thing I do not recommend doing, this is very annoying, I probably shouldn't even mention it, but you'll get players that will select a white dice with white text. That is annoying, because now you can't see anything, but except, well, the table will show you, but the actual dice doesn't show you anything. So that's something to keep in mind. So the combat tracker is in this position here. The reason I have this little gap here is because generally up here on the top left is where all the players would connect. That's where you would see the status of who's connected to the table or not. When you have people connected, you can right-click on their portrait and whisper messages back and forth. You can right-click on your own portrait, and you'll be able to set whether you're AFK. There's some little things like that. Able to have some whisper options and that sort of thing. If you want to whisper to the game master, you can right-click on the dice tower, provided that it's shared, and do it that way. And then there's chat commands too, where you can do /whisper space and then whatever the character's name is. So if you need to know those right-click commands, you can just put a / in the chat and hit enter, and it'll give you all the different types of shortcuts available. So that is something that you'll learn over time as a player. These are things that are not required, but they're definitely tips to help you with navigating this interface. So any questions so far? So we're kind of getting into setup, layout, organization, that sort of thing.
I have a question.
Sure.
One thing I've run into is resolution changing between my particular setup where I have multiple monitors. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to know how to preserve that ratio, the resolution, so that my players will have a consistent view and not have to rearrange windows. Generally,
it depends on their monitor size. And then it also depends on what you're doing in regards to presenting your table. Fantasy Grounds is not inherently able to show on two different monitors. You have to stretch it. Often, if you're going to make it across, are you using it across two monitors? Is that what's happening?
No, Actually, the issue is more. I have a triple monitor setup. Mm-hmm. And this is on a laptop. Mm-hmm. It's a MacBook Pro, so I have a higher quality native display than mm-hmm. I do the two monitors I'm using. But those are still, they're still HDMI. One's HDMI, the other is DisplayPort.
All right.
And on my MacBook, because it's a Retina display, the resolution shrinks down where it is really hard to read on my end. But if I were to move it to one of the displays that are connected via DisplayPort, for example, mm-hmm. The resolution is actually a lot better, and I'm able to view the windows better.
All right. So are you playing face-to-face, or are you playing online?
No, this is online. I'm hosting.
Okay. So online, your resolution does not affect the players. It shouldn't. That's localized. So if you're having issues for you, there's not a whole lot you could do about it. I mean, for Fantasy Grounds, you can play with the issues with setting your resolution in the settings, or you can do it per campaign by doing /scale UI, that sort of thing. But preserving that between your sessions is going to be up to you. Each player can set their own resolution and their own options. So when they log into your table, it's on them. It has nothing to do with what you're doing.
Thank you. Got it.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
So it's native to each person's computer because it has no connection. I mean, if you set your resolution up the way you're going to set it up, it doesn't change the players unless they change it. So they have to change it on their end if they want to see more desktop space or if they want to see larger font, whatever it is. But they got to find a fine balance between being able to read the text and having the room on the table to put their windows. That's really what it comes down to. And I generally recommend at least a 20-inch monitor if you can help it. If you're playing on a 15-inch monitor, it's going to be very, very not so fun. So I've had people say, this sucks. Well, yeah, because you have a little tiny screen and you're not being able to read anything. And it's very difficult to do. So, Smiteworks or Fantasy Grounds can't go out and tell everyone to buy a new computer and a new monitor. But if you are going to, use a small 17, 15-inch monitor, it's going to be difficult. That's all there is to it. There's no way to fix that. That's not a Fantasy Grounds thing. So generally, the players can set the resolution by themselves on their end. They can either do it in the settings. When you first start up Fantasy Grounds, there's a slider where you can set your percentage, or they can do it via a command in the chat window, which is /scale UI space, and then you put a number in there. Could be 100%, could be 110, could be 90, depends on what their needs are. I generally have mine at 85 so that I have room, but I can still kind of read the text. You get any lower than that, it gets too tiny. And if you go over 110%, there's no room to put anything. So that is definitely a common issue, and that issue has been present since Classic. So
Layroon question, sir.
Yep.
On the same topic, one of the things I struggled with for a while regarding the scaling of the UI is sometimes the windows that you've got open then all of a sudden move off the screen and because you can't drag from all sides.
Correct.
Could you speak to that or maybe demonstrate to us how you can get back to the top of a window and get it back into view if you've used the /scale UI command? I
usually scale it back. I just go back to scale UI.
Yeah, which is great. Or sometimes the chat window itself is disappeared below.
So generally, what I'll do is if it's feasible, I'll just get out of Fantasy Grounds. I'll go to the slider. I'll change it there.
Good trick. I like that.
And then go back in. But that kind of sucks if you're in the middle of a game. But that's the way to do it that I know of. Yep. I've done it. I've had that problem before where you can't grab the window because it's way off the screen. Yep. That is a problem. Yep. Okay. Anybody else got any questions about that? There isn't really a good way to change the fonts. What you have is a character field limitation. So like, for instance, on this background where it says Clan Crafter, there is a vertical space here that's only going to be a certain width. It's never going to get taller. Like you can scale windows wider, but you can't scale them vertically. So if you add a font that's too big for that field, it's going to get cut off from the top and the bottom. There are a few options that are free on the Fantasy Grounds Forge that you can download their extensions. I think that is about the only extension I would recommend in regards to gameplay that's actually good and not as damaging or harmful to your session, is that it will allow for a little bit larger text. So it helps with the chat window and that sort of thing, but it doesn't really change the character sheets and that sort of thing, but it does help with the chat window. So there is a way to make the fonts a little bigger, but it's not that great. So just to give you a heads up on that. And the fonts are on the DM's Guild. There's a Montserrat, there's a Roboto, Lato. Matakire made them. They're on there. They're free. Just look up font on the Forge and you'll see a list of them. And you would load those in before you start your session. It's on the DM side, I believe, though. I don't think players can do anything about that. So if the DM doesn't have that extension, you may want to ask them to load that. because I don't think players can change the font. All right, so this is typically my layout that I have for when I'm getting ready to play. I'll have my character sheet here. I'll have this combat tracker kind of overlaid here on top of the chat window. I might stretch it out a little bit longer in case there's a lot more entries on here. It doesn't take long for the combat tracker to fill up once you have your PCs and a few monsters on here. What you want to avoid is, if the GM knows what they're doing, is that when you have 50,000 things on here, you're going to be scrolling up and down on this list. That's kind of annoying after a while. So my advice to game masters is to keep the encounters a little bit smaller and not have 50,000 things on there, because that's really, really hard to manage. It can be annoying too for players. When you go to skip turn, you got to scroll all the way down to the bottom, and it's a pain. So generally I'll have this kind of down here, and I just need this little spot down here at the bottom to read the text. This is just the way I do it. You can do it however you want. You can size it the way you want. Sizing this window, you can right click on the chat window to get it to match up with the combat tracker. The combat tracker does not compress any smaller than it's going to compress. And the reason for that are these shortcuts here you have to be able to see. And if this thing goes any smaller, it hides those options. So you want to, they have it designed to where it won't go any less width-wise because of these options here. These are play options. You have effects, you have reach, you have your attacks, you have your targeting, those sort of things. So those need to be accessible at all times. So that's why you cannot compress this any more than it is. The other thing is, the length of this you can play around with, and you can make it wider. You just can't make it any more narrow. So generally what I'll do is I'll take this chat window, which is generally narrower when you first start. It's like this. So you can right click, unlock it, and drag it to the same width or similar width to your combat tracker to kind of line it up, and then right click and lock it again so it doesn't move on you. That's generally how I have that set, just so that it's in a same spot. And if you leave your windows like this, they're going to stay where you left them. So when you come back to Fantasy Grounds and let's say you're starting another session from last time, it's going to allow you to bring the windows up where you left them. So if I click on the combat tracker, it should be where I left it. If I leave it over here before I leave the table, that's where it's going to show up. That's one of the things that people fight with, is when they use Windows, they'll move it out of the way and close it. And what happens is when you bring it back up, it's in the wrong place or it's covering something else. The idea is to open the window, place it where you want, leave it there, and if it's in the way, close it. And then when you need it again, you can just pop it back up. That's true for game masters or players. And then when I bring up my character sheet, which I'm going to click on this shortcut on the far right of the combat tracker, it's going to bring up the sheet and it's going to place it right where I left it. And if you know that ahead of time, it's a lot easier to manage Fantasy Grounds than moving windows around every 5 minutes. So it'll stay where you left it. It's just that you have to leave these things in strategic places. You won't know that until you actually start getting into the campaign. But once you place a window, you want to try to leave it in that place. So the next thing I'm going to show you is the map. So if you're a player and you don't have the map visible, you forgot to shortcut it or whatever, all you have to do is you can double click on your token if you have one, and that will bring up the map that you were last on. Or you can double click on the token on the far left of the combat tracker and it'll do the same thing. So that is how you bring a map back up, the last one you were on. The game master is the one that controls, which maps are shared and whatnot. But if you want to know what image you were on last, all you have to do is double click here on the right-hand side of your character sheet, or you can double click on the left here where it's on the combat tracker. Either one will bring up the last map that you were on. And as you can see, I have this map in a certain place. So I don't have it sitting all over the place. I just have it here. When I want to see the entire map, I can click this zoom to fit, which is a little shortcut drop down, or I can simply right click, go to view, and go to zoom to fit, and that will also bring it back to center. So if you have it way down here and you need to bring it back, instead of having to mess with this compass thing here, you can just click this zoom to fit, it'll recenter it, or you can right click and go to view, and then you can zoom to fit that way. When you need to size a map window or any window in Fantasy Grounds, it's usually the bottom right corner. And once you have this where you want it and sized, leave it there. And then on the top left corner, there's this little button. It might be a dragon head or whatever symbol, depends on the theme you're using. You left click, drag that down to your hotkey. That way, if you accidentally close it or you start a new, you come back the next day or the next time you play, you can click on the shortcut, it brings it right back, and it puts it where you left it. If you moved it during gameplay, put it back. If you close it here, guess where it's opening? Right where you don't want it. That's where most people have problems with Fantasy Grounds, with navigating through the windows. Leave the windows where you need them to be. Any questions on that?
Is there a good way to put the combat tracker on a hotkey?
Yeah. You can see this combat tracker over here on the right?
Mm-hmm.
The symbol? You can drag that to the hotkeys. And it's right there. So if I close this and I want to bring it up, it's right there.
Oh, cool. Thanks.
What I recommend most game masters to do, players can do this too. In the play area where you select your characters, there's also a notes button. You can make a note that essentially allows you kind of like a playlist. So I'll just call it my run list. So what I'm going to do with this is I might put the combat tracker on here. I might put my map on here. If I'm the game master, I believe, oops, I didn't mean to do that. If you're the game master in the combat tracker, you can also link the player to the sheet if you want. So you can bring that up right away. So when you first start, all you have to do is bring up your note, which you can bookmark that as well. So it's kind of like your launch list. You can place that note in your hotkey, get everything, make sure that all your windows are in the right position before you do that, and then make your shortcut list. And then when you start, all you have to do is bring up that list, and it will put everything where you left it. So you open the list, and you start clicking on these buttons here, and it brings everything up where you left it. That's an easy way to do it. You can use an extension called Windows Saver. There's something that does something similar, but it's relying on the fact that you leave this table the way this is before you exit. So if you close these windows, the Windows Saver doesn't work. I think it's kind of ridiculous, but I don't think it's saving you any time, especially if you make your own list. You don't need it. All it does is when you first start Fantasy Grounds, it pops up and says, do you want to open up your last windows? You say yes, and it does this. It essentially does what this run list does. I don't think you need an extension to do that. I think you just make your own custom list here and just run it that way. Either way, it's gonna save you a little bit of time. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
Definitely.
The other thing is the characters themselves. When you're running a character, especially if you just have a single one, you can shortcut quite a few roles and things on here. So for instance, initiative. Instead of, like if you're on the combat tracker and then all of a sudden your game master says, okay, let's roll initiative, you go all the way back to the main tab, double click on this, or you can drag it to the chat window if you want. That's two ways. But then you can also put it in the hotkeys. So now when he says roll initiative, you can just single click from the hotkey, and it won't matter where you're at on your character sheet, and you can roll it. So shortcutting the initiative is a good way to cut down time and getting lost, especially for players. So when you're, on the back sheet here, you don't have to go back to that tab and get, lose all this. You can just roll initiative from the shortcuts. The only caveat about rolling from this shortcut area is that this number is static. It is no longer attached to the character sheet, so to speak. It's basically, it is what it is. So if you level up and you change your dex and your initiative bonus goes up, or you get some kind of increase or whatever, that is not going to reflect in the old shortcut. So if your character sheet changes, your dex especially, or anything that changes your initiative, you have to redrag it to the hotkeys. So these are not dynamic, they're static. So once you drag that link, it stays that way. It doesn't level up with your character. So that's the one bad thing about creating those kind of shortcuts, is if your character levels up over time, that shortcut is going to be old. And all you have to do is redrag it. So if you have skills on your character sheet, you'll want to shortcut maybe your top 3. So ones I recommend for my players is, hey, let's do perception, because that's used quite a bit. This is a cleric healer, so I'm going to use medicine as my other. And then I might pick one other one here. Let's see, there's religion. So you have your top 3 that you're going to use the most. The other ones you can always come back and roll from here. Speaking of rolling, to roll from the skills list, all you have to do is double click on the total number. So if your game master asks you to roll a history check, you just double click on that total. It'll roll and record it in the chat window. Or if they say, let's roll it in the dice tower, you can take that number, drag and drop it into the dice tower, and the game master will be the only one that's able to see it. So that is... Go ahead.
When you pulled those skills out onto the hotbar, are those also static?
Yes.
Or do those...
Yes, okay. They're static. So if you increased anything, like let's say your base perception or your proficiency bonus goes up, you're going to have to redrag those, because that'll change these rolls. Or if you have a modifier or something like that, you might want to roll from the sheet instead of from the shortcut. But in general, that works pretty good for making things quicker. So initiative and a few of your top 3 skills would be a good use for that. You don't have to shortcut everything, just a few things. Abilities tab, generally you don't have to do anything in here during gameplay. These are just notes and listings of your features. If you have access to the content, you can open these up and read about them. And let's say you wanted to use Blessing of the Forge. To make this easier for your game master, you can actually drag this link into the chat area. The game master can pull this up and say, oh, okay, you want to use this feature. Instead of just saying, I'm going to use Blessing of the Forge, then your DM has to go over here and he's going to be looking for it. It's easier if you just you open it up, drag it to the chat window, and the GM can open that up and access it and see what's going on. So if you want to use any of your features, especially ones that are role-playing or they don't really have any mechanical value, more role-playing stuff, that's a good use for that. This is the way that Fantasy Grounds used to be played before it had automation. So in other words, if you were going to use Blessing of the Forge, you would bring that down and drag and drop it here. The GM would open this, he'd read it, and he would add the modifiers depending on what the situation was in the modifier box or the advantage or disadvantage, or he could make up his own custom modifiers. But now with all the automation and stuff, you don't really normally have to do that anymore. But that is a way to put out something that you want to show your GM. So like respect of the stout folk, that's more of a of a role-playing thing. But if you want to use that feature and you're thinking, hey, maybe I should be getting a little bit more respect here from from others. So you'd put this down and, maybe your GM will be receptive to it, maybe not, but at least you have an easy way to share it. So
LeBron, sometimes when you drag and drop into the quick bar, the default labels can sometimes be cryptic.
Yep.
Can't you relabel those manually?
Yep. Just right click it, click on edit label.
Perfect.
Yep. Yeah, like you'll have one that'll say, it'll either have nothing, like this one has nothing.
There. Yep, exactly. Good example.
So I just put CT for combat tracker.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. All right. So this sheet here is more informational for your characters. Somebody has a hot mic. Is it Rio? Can you mute yourself? I don't know what's causing that, but I can hear you breathing. Sorry. Or I can hear wind or something. Thank you. So the next thing is, let's go to inventory. So generally during gameplay, you don't have to mess with this a whole lot. I don't advise players to mess with it unless they need to change the quantity of stuff they're carrying, or if they need to equip something, or occasionally they might have a magic item that they need to attune to. There'll be a little dot here if there is an identified magic item that needs to be attuned. The attunement can be set in the options, so you can pick how many attunement slots you can have. Some could be based on your proficiency level, or rules as written, I think is 3. You could change, but this defaults to 3. And then you would click on that, and what that does is it keeps players from not having too many items equipped at once. So it prevents them from benefiting from having 50,000 magic items. It's just a balance. You don't have to use that, but that's what that's for. So that's the only thing you normally change here, is you would change whether an item is equipped or unequipped, or you can change the attunement, or maybe at the beginning of a session or at the end, you can update how many items you're carrying. But generally, you don't have to play with this too much. Not during gameplay anyways. You might get a new item dragged over to your sheet or something like that, but generally you don't mess with it too much during gameplay. So your notes section could be something that you would add notes as you're playing. I recommend using the notes that come in Fantasy Grounds as opposed to the notes here. This is more like notes for your character, I would think, as opposed to play notes that you're running for a campaign. So if you really want to do a lot of writing and journal-like stuff, I would just create a note over here. That's a lot easier than trying to scroll down a huge list of notes here. I put things like relationships to other players, or perhaps a feature that isn't really covered that I can put a note there. More stuff that affects the character directly as opposed to journaling. Maybe a description of my character and the appearance, that sort of thing. Because if you have a nice appearance set up here, you can copy and paste that information from your appearance area into the chat window and share that with your players, so you don't have to keep repeating yourself. Like, oh, what does your character look like? You can do that. Or maybe you have some notes here that you want to copy and paste and put down into the chat area. So these are just some things that you might come across. One thing for Fantasy Grounds is you need to have a size, and your alignment does matter in regards to spells. So if it's a protection from good spell or a protection from evil, the alignment needs to be recorded there. If it's not going to work. Fantasy Grounds actually parses from there. So if it sees good or evil, it's going to enable that spell to work. At least that's how it used to work anyways. So if your character sheet isn't fully filled out, that spell of protection from good or protection from evil isn't going to work very well. These are the only two things mechanically that affect the character. The size has to do with the token size. So if your size was large, your token would take up basically 4 squares. Medium, normally, small and medium usually takes up 1 square. And then also it has to do with your reach. So, your reach could be over here, 10 feet away if you're a large creature. So it just depends on what's going on. And then the scale of your character versus the grid is also why you need this. So this is part of the, underneath the game. You don't really notice it, but that's part of it. So your log sheet, this would be if you're playing an Adventures League, you can start a new log. You can actually create a log and title it, put your session and date, your game master, DCI number, all the stuff that went on in your session so you can keep track of it. And then, of course, your actions tab. So this is where you're going to spend a majority of your time when you're playing. So at the very bottom left, you're going to have your combat and actions. That's basically where you want to be when you're playing. So that means all this stuff is set up and it's ready to go. The mode for preparation is when you're setting up your usages and how frequently they replenish. Like it might be daily, once, or it might say rest if it's a short rest. And then your spells, of course, if you want to memorize these or prepare them, you would check these off. And that would allow you to, when you go back to combat mode, it will show that they're readied and they display out here in the combat mode. So you have 3 modes. You have combat mode, which is your main play mode. Preparation modes when you're setting up and when you level and all that stuff and you're trying to memorize new spells and that sort of thing. And then the standard mode is when you're building your character. And that's generally what mode it goes into when you're dragging new spells on here and that sort of thing. So the 3 modes are for different usages, but the main mode when you are using Fantasy Grounds in a game is combat and actions. That's the main mode that you want your character sheet to be in. It's okay if you switch it, but make sure you switch it back. So these are where all of your actions will be, your spells. This is quite more of an elaborate setup here because most character sheets are not going to have all this stuff on it. What I have here is up on the top, I have weapons. When you use a weapon such as a crossbow in this case, and you double click on the attack roll, it's going to automatically check off the usage unless you've done something to it or you have an extension that breaks it. So that's a missile weapon or even a thrown weapon will do the same thing. As far as recovery goes, that's between you and your GM. If he says you can recover up to half of your ammo like the rules is written, you would just simply uncheck the ones that you've recovered. The other thing is, for instance, if you have this Warhammer, you have a choice of using this weapon, and there's 6 weapons that are versatile. The Warhammer, Battle Axe, Spear, the a Quarterstaff, Longsword, and a Trident. Those are your weapons that can be used one or two-handed. You can change the handedness by clicking on the hand, which will do a little bit more damage. And you can also click this for offhand use. So if you have like a rogue, you're using your main weapon, and then you're going to attack with your secondary weapon, you don't get your strength bonus on there, and that's why you would switch that to offhand. So if you're going to make an offhanded attack, like on your bonus action, that would be what you would do. Or if you don't have the feature where you can use 2 weapons without penalty, that would be the when to change that. One thing about this is generally when you have a 2-handed item, such as a crossbow, a bow, or anything like that, you do not benefit from your shield bonus. So you would have to go into your inventory and unequip the shield so that it correctly updates your character sheet so that you're not getting the +2 bonus on your armor class. I think that gets forgotten quite a bit. So if you're using a 2-handed weapon and you also have a shield equipped, just remember that. Now, if you don't like that, if you think that's too cumbersome or too hard to remember, your game master can set up an effect to cancel out that bonus, so you don't have to keep coming back here and messing with it. So when you want to equip your shield, you make sure the little shirt's back on. But it doesn't change. If you add the effect, it won't change the armor class on the character sheet. It just changes it for the actual math. So I created an effect down here called shield drop. And what it does is when the player actually clicks on it, it just subtracts the bonus for that particular item. So it's an armor class (-2), and it's on self. So this is a code that I made for a player. So shield drop with a semicolon and AC (-2), and then it's set to self because it only affects this character. So generally, what I'll have them do is click on this shield drop. It'll come up here in the combat tracker until he's able to either switch the handedness that he's using, and in that case, he can come to the effects and just subtract that off, or if he picks it up or recovers it or whatever. So that's something you can do to kind of make that action a little less annoying. But I'm pretty sure that gets forgotten quite a bit. Is you'll have someone that has a shield bonus and they're using a two-handed weapon, or they switch from single to double-handed to get more damage, they're not dropping the shield bonus. I'm pretty sure that's pretty common. So any questions on that? Okay. Spell slots, generally these are set up automatically when you're creating your character. When you use a spell slot, it's a manual process. Generally, Fantasy Grounds does not select these or check them off unless you do it yourself. So if you use a first level slot, you check it off. The one reason why it doesn't do that, because it doesn't know what level you're casting. So if you have a spell, let's say Cure Wounds, if you open the description on it, it says you can cast it at a higher level. And if you use it at a second level spell slot, unless you have an extension, Fantasy Grounds is not going to know the difference. So if you're going to use this heal, for instance, let's say I'm going to wound one of these characters. We'll say that this guy has 12 points of damage on him. So if I wanted to make sure I healed all those hit points and I wanted to take the risk, I could take this heal, left click and drag it. That's only at first level, but if I right click, that's going to add the second dice, and then I can drop it on him. And effectively, that would be cast at second level. So I'd have to check off the second level slot instead of a first level. So that's how you can manage that. Generally, not always. Casting at a higher level is usually an extra dice. Not always, though. Sometimes it's more range or more of them. But 90% of the spells, when you cast at a higher level, it's either more damage or more healing. So that's how you would do it, is just right-click. When you drag it, that adds the actual extra dice if needed. But Fantasy Grounds won't know that. So you have to manually manage the spell slots if you're using spells. So that's something your players, or as a spellcaster, you're going to have to learn that. So when you use a feature, if you have it set up like we do here to keep track of it, so like this Blessing of the Forge, you get it to use it once or maybe twice, depending on your level. When you do use it, you can set it up to where you can check off the usage, and then it disappears off the sheet because of the way it's set up. So if you go to preparation mode, it's set up for 1 daily. So what happens is when you're playing and you click this, essentially those options are not there until your GM gives you a long rest. So if I go to rest and then I go to long rest, those will come back. Otherwise, you're manually keeping track of it somewhere, which isn't a bad thing always, because around a real table you have to make notes. So you can put a note somewhere you used it for the day. But if you want to set it up kind of more automated, you can set these up to where you have a usage. You don't have to have the effect necessarily, but you can certainly set things up. Like these consumables was something that I set up, especially in a campaign. So long term, you might want to keep track of some of these things like your candles. The nice thing about this is when you check these off, it shows that you used it in a chat area, and it keeps track of them. And when you use up all your candles, that disappears. The way you'd get it back is just go to standard mode and uncheck them if you went to go purchase some new ones to replenish them. You can also add a lighting effect to it if you wanted to get even more fancy.
Quick question. Is there a good way that you could like track how much lay on hands you have or something where there's like a number associated with it?
Yep, it sure can. There's effects for that. You can set it up. What I normally do is I'll set up 3 different healing. I'll have 1, 2, and 5. And that way I can divide it up any way I want, and I can use X amount of usages. Because, sometimes you can't use the whole thing, or you can use half of it, and, that sort of thing. That's how you keep track of that. And then you can also track how many times you've used it. So you do that in preparation mode. You would say lay on hands. You would put the number of uses per day. And then you would set if it was daily or if it was a short rest. And then you would set up your different healing types. So you might right click and add 3 different healing types depending on the increments. So you might do a 1-point increment, a 2-point increment, and a 5-point increment. So maybe you're given 15 total to use. You can just use those. And then Fantasy Grounds also keeps track of that number in the chat window too. So if the GM thought you were cheating or you wanted to go back and audit that, you could. Because this chat log is actually recorded on the back end of Fantasy Grounds. It's an HTML file, and they can go back and audit all of this text here. So there's a record here if it goes in the chat window. That's why I like using these notes to check off what I've used. But yes, absolutely, you could set that up to where you're kind of keeping track of how many points you're using or the usage itself. It's however you want to do it. So if you're only given 15 points to heal for the day, you could essentially set that up for 15 and just check off the ones you've used. So you could do it that way too. I don't know if that helps you or answers your question, but so
definitely does. That's one way to handle it. It seems like it'll get a little bit more painful whenever they're higher level. I have a level 17 character in one of my campaigns who has like over 70 lay on hands, and I wouldn't want to go spamming 5 increments.
Yep. But you can change that.
That makes sense.
You can change the increments though. You can go to 10 or 20 or however you want.
Add enough that it'd be reasonable.
Yep. You can go in groups of 5 or whatever you want to do. So that's just a way to kind of make things a little bit smoother and less annoying, just by making a few changes. So that the spellcasters are kind of a complex. You're going to have a lot more things to keep track of. Now, one thing is you notice I'm having to scroll up and down on this list. So if there's something you're not going to be using for a while, you can actually compress this. So for instance, I have this Dwarven Resilience. So I'll put that on, and once I've done that, that stays on the whole game. I'll just collapse that until I need it. If I don't plan on using my consumables, I can collapse that. So that way you're not cluttering up your sheet too much. You can actually collapse these features until you need them. So that way you only have one page instead of scrolling up and down. So that can save you a little bit of headache. If you're like a spellcaster and you have all that stuff, that may be helpful to you. So that's just a something that you'll learn as players, get used to the interface. They'll go, oh, I don't have to have all these expanded. The other thing is being prepared for your turn. I don't know how many times a player will just sit there and space out and always have problems with the same spell over and over and over. So let's say, for instance, Guiding Bolt. Maybe that's not a spell you're used to, and you don't understand how it works, you can actually shortcut that into the hotkeys and then read that as you're waiting. Have this stuff ready to go. I mean, I don't know what you're doing in the meantime. I mean, you might be listening to people role play and stuff, but get some of this stuff in the shortcut so you can read it and have it handy for you. So when it comes to your turn, you're ready to go. You're not diddle-daddling around. That's generally what happens. Is you'll have players that just sit there and space out for 10 minutes. When it comes to their turn, they don't know what's going on, or they're on their phone or whatever. But not much you can do about that. But to make things a little easier for you, if you need something that always plagues you or you can never remember, you can always put it in the hotkeys. And that way, when it comes to your turn or when you're waiting on your turn, you can start looking at the different things that are constantly plaguing you. Eventually, you won't need those shortcuts. So use the shortcuts below as much as possible. That's what they're for. It gives you the flexibility to do your roles, and you can even, when you're doing character creation, you can shortcut your background. You can shortcut your class. So when you're leveling up and you're creating your character, you have access to these shortcuts, which has tables and links that have to do with character creation. So when you're building your character, it would be handy to have this shortcut for your class abilities and such. So you put that in the hotkeys when you're building characters. And then you can go in and read the features that you're looking at. So there's a lot of things that one can do to make this process easier. It's just a matter of knowing when, where, and how to do it. So we're going to move on. This is more organizational things and things you could do on your sheets to kind of track things and to kind of get the layout to be a little bit better. Now we're going to talk a little bit about maps and movement and such. So is there anything that I missed that you guys want to cover? Because we're going to talk about targeting and movement and such. Okay. To address the stream, is there a way to quickly display the area of a spell? No, not really. Well, I mean, you have to draw it, and I'll show that shortly. I'm talking to the stream, sorry. Okay, so that's a good point. So let's do Dorag here is my character. When it's your turn, you want to make sure that you have your tokens selected. So this token is highlighted, it's selected, and once you have it selected, in most cases, players, it will be selected. It's the game masters that need to, be privy to that. Okay, so here's Dorag. So let's say it's his turn. So you pass your turn by clicking this arrow for next actor or turn complete. You can actually shortcut that arrow. So if you don't want to reach over here every time, you can put it down here in the hotkeys. And you can use that to advance your turn. I don't know how many times I've had to remind people, is your turn over? And they go, oh, yeah. Then they're looking for the button. If you have it shortcutted, you'll remember it more. But its default is on the chat frame here, or the combat tracker frame. So make sure you advance your turn when your turn's over, because that happens a lot. You'll just kind of sit there and space out, and people need to, they need their turn. So you're just sitting there waiting, like, what's going on here? And you go, hey, are you done with your turn? And I go, oh, yeah. And then they'll click on it. But that's something that you'll have to learn. It's not much you can do about it. It's just remembering to advance your turn when you're done. So it's Dorag's turn. So he has some options here. So what I'm going to do is perform a bless by this character here. So right now he has himself targeted, which may or may not be good. You can see this in the combat tracker. Generally, to target something, you hold down the right control key and you click on the token that you wish to target. So it might be multiple targets. So the reason I'm going to use Bless is because it has multi-steps to it. It is a simple spell, however, there are steps to it. So first of all, the players need to be in range. So you have a 30-foot range, and it's a concentration spell. And it says you can bless up to 3 characters of your choice within range whenever a target makes an attack roll, blah, 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 and it adds this bonus. Well, this is coded to where I can affect everyone that I have targeted. So if you do it that way, it's a lot quicker than dragging this effect to each individual target. So let's just say I wanted to bless these 3 individuals, or maybe I want to do all the squishy people and not the fighters. So first of all, I need to get an idea of area of effect. So someone was asking in the chat if there's an easier way or quicker way. Not really. You have to right-click, go to pointers. In this case, it's a radius. So I'm going to draw a circle, just left-click and drag, and that's going to give you your radius. And that's basically the people that he can affect. And I would say this is a go-to. But nonetheless, that's how you do it. There's no simple way to do that. There is some extensions out there that gives you a spell token, but that requires you to know how to use it, and the DM has to have that loaded, and it would have a token on your combat tracker, or on your actions tab, that you can drag over to the table here, and it would target that individual, or it would target several, but you have to have it set up and loaded. And it's quite an extensive thing that I'm not going to cover in this, but this is the way you do it with Fantasy Grounds without all that extra stuff. So the answer is no, there's not a quicker way to do it, unless you use extensions and all kinds of other stuff. But then again, who knows? But you move these generally from the center. So what I normally do is I'll draw the spell out somewhere else, and then I'll drag it into place. Because quite often it's in the wrong place anyway. So when you go to draw it for the first time, you right-click, add pointer. Maybe you want to do a square. So you just left-click and drag. And then once you have the correct size, then move it into location. That's generally the best practice on that. So now we know who the targets are. So we're going to manually select who we're going to benefit from the bless spell. So I'm going to hold the control key. I don't have anyone targeted now. So I'm going to target the rogue, the sorceress, and Zayla Truesong, who's a bard. So all 3 of them are now targeted. So I just held down the right control key, and I selected the targets, and that adds them to my list here. And then I'm going to apply the effect. But once I apply the effect will go on to whoever has that tag on them. It looks like I might have missed Zayla. Yeah, I missed her. So if that's the case, you could manually just drag it to her. So there's 2 ways you can do that. You can target multiple targets, or you can drag it one at a time. Now, if you wanted to do a or a higher level casting for Bless, you can add an additional person. So instead of using a first level slot, I can use a second level slot, and then I would just target myself. So I might just bless myself in this case. Once that effect's on there, it's automatically going to add a D4 to your attack rolls and a D4 to your saves. And it has a duration of 10 rounds. Now, for some reason, if this player gets hit, Fantasy Grounds will automatically keep track of that. It will roll to see if you can maintain concentration based on your Constitution score. And if you fail, you don't make the save, then that blessed effect will roll off of all the people that are impacted by it. So if you get nailed by an attack and it does damage, it's going to roll, and if you fail that roll, it's going to remove the effect automatically. Now, it doesn't remove this radius thing. So you're going to have to right-click, go to pointers, and remove pointer to get rid of that. So whoever was asking that, I'm sorry, that's the way to do it. Is there a way to quickly display the area? Yeah, okay, we already got that. Okay, so that is that is one thing to do is, when you're targeting, is to hold down the control key and click on the targets. Now, if you want to remove the targets, which you should do in this case, is you're going to hold down the control key and repeat the process. So as you hold down the right control key, you're clicking on all the targets that you had previously targeted, including yourself, and that removes them. A lot of people forget to untarget once they're done. So when you're done with it, make sure you untarget if it makes sense. Because what will happen is you'll do your next action and it will affect all those players, whoever you still have targeted. So remember to untarget when you're done. The other way you can target as the game master is there's a selection mode, and you can target all these individuals and then apply something on the map. But that's a game master only thing. So that's something that you'll have to experience when you're actually running the game. So that's some of the things on the character sheet and the map. The other thing is movement. So in this case, this player here will say, we'll just use Dory again. So when I'm moving, it's going to create, if the map is locked, if your game master has a token lock on, with all the things selected, like I did earlier, you can move everyone at once. So that selection mode allowed me to select all the tokens and move them at once. So anybody see any problem with this already, other than everyone moving at once?
I assume some people would move invalidly.
Yep. So in this case, I would not allow this because, well, it's not too bad. So I'd go ahead and allow that because it's not really crossing over debris too much. And she didn't move very far, so I'd give her that. Dorig, however, no, you're not you're not going to occupy the same space as an object or another player or a GM, depending, unless he said he's going to climb up on that barrel or something like that. So I might say, no, you need to go around it or stand next to it or on the side of it. This player is cutting through, coming through here, and he's also, I guess I'd allow that. He can kind of snake around that. This one here, that's valid. Now this one, I might say no, because they're going through another player, but they're going to lose 10 feet anyway, so he only moved 20 feet. So that's valid. But if he was trying to move the entire 30 feet, I would say no. I would reject the movement and make them retrace their path. This is a definite no. So I'd have her move up. And that would be it. So it just depends. You don't want to move through objects unless, you stated something or your game master allows it. So like Shayra here, I would ask her to plot around it or lose 10 feet to go through that barrel. Unless she says, I'm going to do an athletics check and jump over the top of this or something, spring off of it or something. I would allow that, but it just depends. But don't move through objects and enemies. And then if there's like a wall there, even if it doesn't have line of sight on it, you might want to ask before you move through it, because it could be rough terrain. Like moving through these ropes might not be a good place to move. You might lose 5 feet or something like that by traversing through these areas that are cluttered. So this is just something to keep in mind when you're playing is, when you're moving, make sure that you're asking about the terrain if you can see it. Like here, you wouldn't necessarily be able to move down the side of this deck without some kind of impediment, because you got these cannons And then you have the cannonballs areas. So if you're going to move straight down here, I would think you can only move maybe 10 or 15 feet at a time. You're not going to be able to dash through that. No way. And that would be a judgment call by your DM and something you decide as a group. So if you wanted to dash through there, I would say no, you're not dashing through there. You're only going to get maybe halfway through, and you're going to have to make an acrobatics or some kind of dex check so you don't fall on your ass. So that's, there's common sense things that come into play. But when you're using Fantasy Grounds and you're just kind of moving around willy-nilly, you got to kind of, keep that in mind that it may not be the prudent thing to do is moving through objects. You might want to trace a path that's going to avoid that sort of thing. The other thing is you can use the arrow keys. So you can actually tab or use the arrow keys, kind of like a video game, I guess. You can use those, and that will move you a square at a time. The only thing is diagonal movement. It's kind of janky. Now the DM could have it set to where every other square is 10 feet because of Pythagorean's theorem. So that's 30 feet because you're moving diagonally. Now in the settings, there's nothing you can do about this as a player, but in the settings, the DM can change that to where it is 1.5 times or 1 time. See, it only counts as 25. Or raw 26.9 is actual movement. Or they can leave it on 1.5, which is more accurate. So movement, managing your character sheet, having things laid out where you want them, where you can see them, those are the biggest things you have to worry about as a player. Leveling up and all that stuff isn't as bad when you're actually, you're not playing and you're just kind of, setting up your character. You don't normally have to do that during a session. Hopefully your game master has your character, set for you if you're going to be playing a one-shot. It really, it's one game. I mean, you don't need to spend hours and hours for 4 hours of play. Generally, I'll just have like 8 players they can pick from. And if they don't like it, well, not much I can do about it. I don't worry about it too much unless it's like a super high stakes celebrity game or something. Then we might sit down and create characters or something like that. But generally, I just give the players something to work with. Now, when it comes to Adventures League, it's a little different. You have to manage characters quite a bit. You have to go through their protocols and how they do it. But generally, you can export your XML sheet and give that to your next GM or your next table. And it will carry all your notes. So if you've recorded all your session log notes in your log area, that will carry over. So it'll be in your character sheet. The only thing that doesn't carry over when you export a character is the artwork. So if you have a portrait, you'll have to send that to the GM if they don't already have it. So those don't generally port over. There are some utilities online that are kind of third-party. They are for converting PDFs to Fantasy Grounds or vice versa, go to Fantasy Grounds to a PDF. They work sometimes they don't. There's been a lot of changes to Fantasy Grounds itself and how the parsing works. So if you come across one of these websites that does a conversion for you in regards to like D&D Beyond or taking your XML file and printing it off as a PDF because you might want to play your actual character at a real table. So if that's the case, those websites are generally not as reliable, and you might have to recreate your character, unfortunately. But there are options out there. But if those options are working to this day, it's hard to say. So is there anything on here that we didn't cover you'd like to see or talk about? We're going to wrap this up soon. Okay. How about in the internet, on the interwebs? Anybody have any questions out there? Now, I'm going to do this course again in a couple days. The main reason we did this is to give people a better idea of how to use Fantasy Grounds. It's not going to cover every little single niche case. I mean, there's going to be things that occur at your table, or there might be some extensions that are running that we weren't able to address. I mean, those sort of things I can't do much about. That's up to the game master. But in general, if you lay out your table, you manage your character sheet, and you move on the on the map properly, and you remember to target and untarget when needed, things go pretty smooth. Use the shortcuts, and you use that, a certain way to lay out your table every time you play. It really speeds things up. And you won't be as clunky. So even if you don't know how to play Fantasy Grounds, or you don't know anything about the rules, at least you'll have a way to set up your table. So I'm going to do this again. We also recorded this, so if you missed any of it, you can always go back to YouTube, and the links will be in the announcer, or they'll be live up on the social media. So any other questions before we go?
Thank you for doing it. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lightroom.
Yeah, no problem. I hope that helped a little bit. Like I said, this can be kind of intimidating if you've never used Fantasy Grounds, or if you haven't used it in a while, or if you've never played. That's another thing, is sometimes game masters see everything from their end. They don't really get to experience what it's like for a player. So to be able to train them and show them how to make it easier on them makes your job easier in the long run. So anyhow, take care, everyone. Happy gaming. Good luck. Don't forget that FG PugCon is happening this weekend. It's in the announcements, or you can look for it online. I've done a lot of social media advertising for it, but basically you can sign up on Warhorn, and then you have to register for their event on Warhorn, and you also have to go on their Discord. So there's a few steps. I've outlined that in the announcements area in our Discord.
Thank you very much.
Yep. And next month, at the end of the month, we're going to do Founders Day Weekend 5. It's our 5th one. I can't believe it. But that'll be similar to PugCon. We're going to invite some guests and have some games and such. So anyhow, take care, everyone. I'll see you around. Bye-bye.